No deal. That's how the Sons of Liberty and the rest of the Patriots in North Carolina, pretty much all of them, responded in 1776 to a British offer from General Clinton. I guess they were bad back then, to basically give up your guns, give up your friends, give up your right to local self-government, and we'll supposedly give you peace, if that is actually considered peace. So I've got an overview of this really interesting history. And maybe it gives us a few lessons on how to deal with the empire once again today. But first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, May 6th, 2024. And let's kick it off here with a post on X, or a tweet from S.W. OConnell, who's a very interesting history author. And he points out that yesterday in history, this is May 5th, 1776, North Carolina in Wilmington, North Carolina, General Henry Clinton issues a proclamation denouncing the wicked rebellion and recommending that the inhabitants of North Carolina return their allegiance to the king. It was a strong, I guess we could call it, recommendation. He did offer a full pardon. He's basically saying, I'm going to come and get anybody who doesn't. But if you do, I'll be kind and give you a full pardon, full amnesty to everyone except General Robert Howe and Cornelius Harnett. Now, he also demanded that everyone lay down their arms and then on top of it dissolve their local assemblies, their committees of correspondence, their committees of safety, all these local organizations to run things. In other words, again, give up your guns, give up your free speech, give up your right to assembly, give up your friends, and we will give you peace. Here, for example, he writes, whereas a most unprovoked and wicked rebellion hath for some time past prevailed. Think about how government looks at stuff that the people do. If government does whatever government wants, and if the people don't like it, and they say no to it, government says this is an unprovoked attack on government instead of government attacking the people. And so this unprovoked and wicked rebellion now exists in His Majesty's province in North Carolina, and the inhabitants forgetting their allegiance to their sovereign and denying the authority of the laws and statutes of the realm, having a succession of crimes proceeded to this total subversion of all legal authority, usurping the powers of government and erecting a tyranny in the hands of congresses and committees of various denominations. They did not like the idea of the provincial congresses, basically the notion that, well, government could just suspend a local legislature, like the New York Restraining Act in 1767, the Townshend Acts, or shutting down the assembly in Massachusetts. Well, all these provincial congresses in Virginia and Massachusetts and North Carolina were popping up all over the place. And they're saying, well, this is illegal and a usurpation and a tyranny. If you guys are going to have local government, that isn't under our control. Sounds very familiar to me. He said, I have it in command to proceed forthwith against all such men or bodies of men in arms and against all such congresses and committees thus unlawfully established as against open enemies of the state. So in other words, I'm coming to get you, but, I got a little something for you. And here from T.J. Martinelli, he says, although taxation without representation is a common phrase to describe the colonists' most common or most well-known grievance against British rule, an attempted gun confiscation by General Gage, this was up in Massachusetts, but we also in New England, we also learned that it's from Henry Clinton down in the South as well. Gun confiscation and his troops occupying Boston following the Boston Tea Party actually led to the direct conflict between the Redcoats and the colonists. It was the same down in North Carolina, which we're discussing today. Now, some people, of course, tell us that it was only about the fighting was only about trying to get representatives in Parliament so they could tax the people. Well, maybe they made some of those claims of what they wanted, but they weren't fighting back until the gun grabber scheme came into effect. They did not fight back until they were attacked to take their means of self-defense. And in 1774, when the British passed the Coercive Acts, what a lot of people call the Intolerable Acts today, these were in response, of course, to the Boston Tea Party in late 1773. The Boston Tea Party of 1773 was resistance to the Tea Act of earlier that year, which was a reinforcement of an unconstitutional tax, or at least how the colonists saw it, an unconstitutional tax from the Townshend Acts of 1767. We can keep going back and back and back in response to this. Now, even though the taxes were supposed to raise revenue, that was the claim. Oh, we're doing this to raise money. The essential point behind them, and everyone understood this, was to affirm the principle that Parliament could tax the colonies without their consent on whatever they wanted, whenever they want, for whatever amount they wanted. This was really affirming the power of the Declaratory Act of 1766, which at first Benjamin Franklin thought would be innocuous, and then he learned pretty quickly this is the worst thing, where they claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And even Alexander Hamilton, a young revolutionary Alexander Hamilton in December of 1774, kind of goes after this notion that it was just about a small tax or representation or anything. He said, what then is the subject of our controversy with the mother country? What can actuate those men who labor to delude any of us into an opinion that the object of contention between the parent state and the colonies is only 3d duty upon tea? This is a small tax. This isn't a huge deal. We all understand this, but we're not opposing you. We're not looking to resist what you're doing. They still were not actively fighting back with physical violence, but they were using non-compliance, non-importation agreements, boycotts, and things like that. And they were not claiming that it was just about the amount of tax. Oh, we just need different people in power to lessen the taxes. We're taxed enough already. No. It was the notion that they had the authority to do it in the first place, the internal tax. He said, the Parliament claims a right to tax us in all cases whatsoever. This is referencing the Declaratory Act again. Its late acts are in virtue of that claim. How ridiculous, then, is it to affirm that we are quarreling for the trifling sum of 3d a pound on tea, when it is evidently the principle against which we contend? Man, that is the Alexander Hamilton we unfortunately lost. He turned into some other monster. Maybe he always was, and he was an opportunist, but he was certainly writing some good stuff back in the day. Now, these coercive acts, Mike Meharry points out that these acts included the Boston Port Act. These are in 1774, punishing the colonies, primarily Massachusetts, for the Boston Tea Party, but they also wanted to intimidate the rest of the colonies into thinking, well, this is going to shut them down as well. These acts, and we know this from their letters, and I think I've got a link that mentions that as well later in this episode. These acts included the Boston Port Act, closing the Boston port, the Massachusetts Government Act, stripping virtually all authority from the colonial government, the Administration of Justice Act, removing authority from local courts, and then authorizing trials to be held in Great Britain instead of Massachusetts. They wanted to sweep people away so you couldn't have a jury of your peers. And then the Quartering Act, allowing British troops to take over private buildings. Hear from Dave Copel, who has a great article and a longer essay as well, which I'll mention as well, The American Revolution Against British Gun Control. And here's how Dave put it. The particular provisions of the coercive acts were offensive to Americans. So just going over the concept of this. But there was something underlying this as well that they were concerned about. It was the possibility, he writes, that the British might deploy the army to enforce them that primed many colonists for armed resistance. They were expecting the British to send in troops. Of course, they had already been occupying Boston. We know what happened with the massacre in Boston as well. And so they were expecting more troops to be on their way to kind of force their way. You're going to do what we tell you, or we're going to make you do what we tell you, and we're going to prevent you from defending yourselves. We're going to use gun control, and I'll get to that in a moment. The Patriots of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania resolved, quote, that in the event of Great Britain attempting to force unjust laws upon us by the strength of arms, our cause we leave to heaven and our rifles. So the mentality was, okay, we've been opposing all this stuff all along, but now if you try to ramp it up and try to use violence to get us on board, then, well, we are gonna fight back. And that's how things did play out. But as Dave points out, a South Carolina newspaper essay, which was reprinted in Virginia, which I have the link to the original here from Digital History of South Carolina. These will all be in the show notes as well. It was reprinted in Virginia. It urged that any law that had to be enforced by the military was automatically illegitimate. And T.J. Martinell cites it here. When an army is sent to enforce laws, it is always an evidence that either the lawmakers are conscious that they had no clear and indisputable right to make those laws, or that they are bad and oppressive. Good ideas. We've often heard people say today, and I see people post this on social all the time, good ideas don't require force. This isn't just a modern thought. This is the mentality of the American revolutionaries back in 1776. Like, look, or 1774, really, here. They're saying, like, look, if you have to actually enforce this through violence, if you have to use a military force, this is oppressive, it's bad, it's unjust, it shouldn't exist. You have to reconsider it. Wherever the people themselves, this essay goes, this is from the Reverend William Tennant, letter to the editor, August of 1774. Wherever the people themselves have had a hand in making laws, according to the first principles of our Constitution, there is no danger of non-submission, nor can there be any need of an army to enforce them. So then on October 17th, 1774, Lord Dartmouth, who was the Royal Secretary of State for America, he sent General Gage in Boston a letter to urge him to disarm New England completely to the extent, well, I guess, reasonably possible. And here's how he put it. Amongst other things which have occurred on the present occasion as likely to prevent the fatal consequence of having to recourse to the sword, that of disarming the inhabitants of Massachusetts Bay, Connecticut, and Rhode Island has been suggested. And he's like, go for it if you can make it successful. So the mentality of people in power, and I think we have the same mentality today, nothing has changed as far as the underlying principle. Government is going to try to force their way on you. If the people, even in vast majorities, don't like what government's doing, government is going to, try to use superior force. And they think that the only way to keep peace is to disarm the people, which is an even more superior type of force. It's a very aggressive approach on things. And here's how Dave Copel put it in his much longer essay. This will be linked to in the show notes as well. He says, 2 days after Lord Dartmouth dispatched his disarmament recommendation to General Gage, King George III and his ministers blocked importation of arms and ammunition to America. Most people are totally unaware of this in the discussion that we just need to get representatives to tax the people. I mean, the British didn't march on Lexington and Concord, or as we find out, they didn't march on Moores Creek Bridge as well in 1776. They didn't march there because they were coming to collect taxes. They were coming to force submission, and they were coming to force submission through gun control. This has been the source of tyranny all along. So Dartmouth sends this to Gage. Before Gage even gets the letter a couple months later or weeks later, however long it took to get there, they've already issued another order saying we're having no more arms or ammunition coming to America, which would have been very problematic at that time. The 6-month decree, Dave writes, was repeatedly renewed, remaining in effect until the peace treaty in 1783. They literally kept going with this. Read literally, the order only required a government permit to export arms or ammunition from Great Britain to America. And in practice, surprise, surprise, no permits were ever granted. So a permission slip from government is a way for government to totally control you. It's not really liberty. It's not freedom if you first have to get approval from government, because government might decide to take that whole process away. They might just say, well, you don't qualify. And if one looks at the permit process in places like Los Angeles County, or here in Orange County, where you basically have to know somebody in power in order to get approved, this is very, very obvious. Here's the order from the king on October 19th, 1774. His Majesty, judging it necessary to prohibit the exportation of gunpowder or any sort of arms or ammunition out of this kingdom, or carrying the same coastwise for some time, doth therefore, with the advice of his privy council, hereby order, require, prohibit, and command that no person or persons whatsoever, except the Master General of the Ordnance for His Majesty's service. So no one is allowed to do this unless it's a government official. Again, very familiar to what we live under today, people demanding that the only people who have maybe more. Well, I think the long run goal is that the only people who have a means of self-defense, the tools of self-defense, arms and ammunition, really are government. Of course, they'll just try to draw a line and say, well, only certain things like military-grade weapons should only be in the hands of the military. Well, that line is going to keep getting pushed over time. Eventually, you'll find people who want to apply that to literally everything. And that's what they did back in 1774 as well. So no one is allowed to do this at any time during the space of 6 months from the date of this order in council, presumed to transport into any parts of out of this kingdom, or carry coastwise any gunpowder or any sort of arms or ammunition, or ship or lade any gunpowder or any sorts of armor, ammo on board any ship or vessel, on and on and on. Now, I covered this gun control program primarily as it played out in Massachusetts, leading to the shot heard around the world in Lexington and Concord, the series of events, the gun control efforts that led to that in 1775. I covered that in an episode last April. It was gun control, what started the war for independence. Anyways, but it also did spread south. It wasn't just Lexington and Concord. So North Carolina. Here's a letter from the Massachusetts Committee of Safety. Right after Massachusetts, the people there experienced the shot heard around the world, the battles that were going on. Of course, they were fighting a lot of other stuff before that without the hot war that was already happening. So they sent out circular letters to all the people in all the other colonies saying, hey, you got to stand firm. We need some help. This was on the 23rd of April. So a few days later, they sent out a copy of something that was written on the 19th. A brigade consisting of about 1,000 or 1,200 men landed at Phipps Farm at Cambridge and marched to Lexington, where they found a company of our colony militia in arms, upon whom they fired without any provocation and killed 6 men and wounded 4 others. Now, hear from Travis Copeland over at All Things Liberty, Journal of the American Revolution. Great website if you want to read some history and learn some stuff that we don't normally learn in school. This is titled North Carolina's Response to Lexington and Concord, because Lexington and Concord didn't just remain in Lexington and Concord. Other people started seeing this as, well, this is good. If they did it there, they can do it here. John Dickinson, in his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, was urging the other colonies to at least take some kind of a stance against the New York Restraining Act under the Townshend Acts in 1767, because if they can restrict the rights of the people in New York, they can restrict the rights of people anywhere. And here's how Travis put it. In the age of foot speed news, a letter penned on April 19th could take weeks to reach the inhabitants of North Carolina. It was actually penned on the 23rd. But finally, on Friday, April 28th at 8 p.m., colonists from Alexandria, Virginia, sent the statement and letter to Fredericksburg, and from there to Surry County, Chowan, and Onslow, North Carolina. I know I pronounce all those names wrong. I always get them wrong. I gratefully learned that James Iredell is actually spelled James Iredell was spelled or pronounced James Iredell from someone who watches the show that told me how to pronounce it properly some years ago. But anyways, a flurry of exchanges between Virginia and North Carolina created a clamor. There's war. So each county started passing it on. It gets to one, it goes to another, it goes to another. This was the network of the committees of correspondence. This is also why the British didn't like people organizing, having the right to peaceably assemble. Even if they didn't recognize this as a government, they were saying you can't even have these assemblies. Each county repeated to the next, quote, disperse the material passages through all your parts. On May 3rd, Edenton and Chowan passed on the news. The delegates at Craven County received the news on May 6th. And then by May 8th, it gets to Wilmington, where Cornelius Harnett, we got to remember that name here, for God's sake, send the man on without the least delay and write to Mr. Marion to forward it by night and day. I like that. It was a bit of a rhyme. And also on May 8th in Brunswick, we get Robert Howe, another important figure in this episode. Though I know you stand in no need of being prompted when your country requires your service, yet I cannot avoid writing to you to beg you to forward the paper containing such important news, and pray order the express you send to ride night and day. Hear from Stephen Holbrook's great paper, great article, essay, I guess we could call it. It's a long one. The Right to Bear Arms in the First State Bills of Rights, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Vermont, and Massachusetts. He points out that Lexington sparked the seizure of public arms and arms smuggling by the colonists. So once word spread, everyone who was already kind of organizing into militias at this point, they already had these committees of correspondence, they already had these committees of safety, they started arming up. And I see people do this today. Every time there's a new proposal for a gun control scheme, sales go through the roof. It's the gun grabbers that drive more gun ownership than anyone else. It should be high no matter what, but that's another story. And so Holbrook understands that, well, once the people saw what was going down, this was no longer going to be about petitions or protests or non-compliance and non-importation. This is getting down to the real deal here. Governor Martin in North Carolina, I believe it's Josiah Martin, proclaimed against those, quote, endeavoring to engage the people to subscribe papers obliging themselves to be prepared with arms, to array themselves in companies, and to submit to all the illegal and usurped authorities of committees. So he's saying, like, look, okay, these people, these committees who are urging the people to arm up, to train, to be prepared, this is all illegal. Ignore this. This is bad news. So here on May 18th, 1775, Governor Josiah Martin, that is the name, he sent a letter to the Earl of Dartmouth again. The inhabitants of this country on the seacoast are for the most part infected with the ill spirit that prevails in the adjacent provinces of Virginia and South Carolina, whose extravagancies they are copying by arming men, electing officers, and so forth. Just the idea of a militia, of a well-armed public, was a bad idea. They didn't, well, at least to people in power. It had always been a bad idea to the people in power. In this little town, they are now actually endeavoring to form what they call independent companies under my nose. And civil government becomes more and more prostrate every single day. So on May 25th, we get three more generals. It's not just General Gage. Dave Copel points out that the government in London dispatched more troops and three more generals to America: William Howe, Henry Clinton, and John Burgoyne. The generals arrived on May 25th, 1775, with more orders from Dartmouth. Quote, that all cannon, small arms, and other military stores of every kind that may be either in any public magazine or secretly collected together for the purpose of aiding rebellions should also be seized and secured. Anything they can use to fight back with, anything of any equal level of our power, we have to seize and secure it. Again, I keep saying it sounds familiar, but it does. And we have to kind of understand that a government that claims unlimited power, that claims the power to determine the extent of its own power, cannot be trusted, because it will always devolve into this kind of thing. So they want to seize all the arms, secure them so no one else can use them, and that the persons of all such as, according to the opinions of His Majesty's Attorney and Solicitor General, have committed themselves in acts of treason and rebellion should be arrested and imprisoned. So then on May 31st, because the word is spreading about this happening, we get the Mecklenburg County in North Carolina. The Committee of Safety there passed something known as the Mifflinburg Resolves. And he says they fell short of expressly declaring independence, but really they did so in principle. Here's what it said. We conceive that all laws and commissions confirmed by or derived from the authority of the King or Parliament are annulled and vacated, and the former civil constitution of these colonies for the present wholly suspended. The provincial congress of each province, they write, under the direction of the great Continental Congress, is invested with all legislative and executive powers within their respective provinces, and no other legislative or executive does or can exist at this time in any of these colonies. So they're just declaring at this point that absolutely they are independent of all British authority there in Mecklenburg. That was on May 31st. This was also really the basis for a second document, which is known as the Mecklenburg County Declaration of Independence. That was also May of 1775. There's a lot of dispute of whether or not those were real, but we have the copy of this one, which certainly affirms that the people of Mecklenburg County were, in essence, separating from Britain in 1775. And so then on June 19th, the North Carolina delegates to the Continental Congress sent a letter urging more arming up, more militia. I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to first point out that all the stuff that I mentioned, I've got a lot of source documents that I'm citing in this episode, some articles and things like that. If you want to read and learn more in context on your own time, because I'm just going through the highlights, you're going to find that in a blog post that we publish a couple of hours after the live stream is done over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. We've got blogs for every individual episode that Alan Mosley organizes. He also includes all the various platforms we're on. So if you're watching on one of the live streams, whether it's YouTube or Facebook or X or LinkedIn or Twitch or wherever, we also live stream over at Odyssey and Rumble.com. If you want to try something else, we archive the videos over at BitChute and Minds and various other places, Brighteon. And we have the audio-only podcast session. You'll find all of those in that blog post that Alan organizes, and I will get published a little bit later today. But while I'm here, I want to take a quick moment and say hello to everyone out in the live chat. Over on Rumble, I appreciate the Ron Paul Liberty Report crew always stopping by. That's really awesome to me. Gypsy Magic, Brewster, Render, Dennis, M. Savent, and a few others. I appreciate you guys being here. And then over on some of the other platforms like YouTube and Facebook, there's David and Len, Juggles, Chris, let's see who else I'm scrolling through here. Howard and Paul, Haji, Cheriton, and others. Thank you all for being here. Whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one, thank you so much. Let me pull up my notes here and we can get right back to it. So we get the members of the Continental Congress from North Carolina. They sent a circular letter to all the residents of North Carolina via the committees of correspondence, the committees of safety. And they point out, they're talking about the natural right of self-defense. This is the underlying issue here of why the fighting broke out. They say it is the right of every English subject to be prepared with weapons for his defense. We conjure you by the ties of religion, virtue, and love of your country to follow the example of your sister colonies and to form yourselves into a militia. We know that Patrick Henry was certainly organizing in Virginia. We know the Sons of Liberty, Joseph Warren, Samuel Adams, Hancock, and others were organizing up in Massachusetts and elsewhere. But they're urging them, hey, look, this is, for love of virtue and your country, you should be as armed and capable of defense as possible. We've lost this mentality to a great extent today. They point out, they say, carefully preserve. This is recognizing the gun control, the prohibition on importation. Carefully preserve the small quantity of gunpowder which you have amongst you. It will be the last resource when every other means of safety fail you. Great Britain has cut you off from further supply. So everyone knew what was going on. Even though we're not taught this in the history books, I had to learn this by reading Dave's article. It took me many years to actually figure out what was actually happening. And I'm still learning as I go here, and I try to share with you as much as possible. But they point out we cannot conclude without urging again to you the necessity of arming and instructing yourselves to be in readiness to defend yourselves against any violence that may be exerted against your persons and property. So that was sent out to the committees of safety. And then just weeks later, Josiah Martin, the governor of North Carolina, he issued what's now known as the Fiery Proclamation. He called on basically loyalists to fight back, and he banned all the independent militias, because that's what government does. They see people taking a stand, exercising their rights, especially when it comes to the right of self-defense, their natural right, the first law of nature, the right of self-preservation. Government just issues ban. They start with licensing and permits, and when that doesn't work the way they like, they come down with the hammer. He says, I do hereby forewarn the people against any and every such election of officers to which they are invited, and caution them against any obedience in regard to any persons who have been or may be so chosen and appointed, hereby declaring that such election illegal, unconstitutional, and null and void to all intents and purposes. So anyone joining a militia, no one can be at the head of a militia unless they're appointed by the king. So you can't be there. You can't have a committee unless we've decided through our royal prerogative if you can have a committee. And then we'll tell you how long you can actually exist and whether or not you can meet. He said, and that the said John Ashe and Robert Howe's alias Howe, Robert Howe, before mentioned, and both of them and every other person and persons who have or have presumed to array the militia and to assemble men in arms within this province without my commission or authority. So if you armed up and you assembled with arms without permission, you were a traitor. Just merely exercising your right of self-defense, have invaded His Majesty's just and royal prerogative and violated the laws of their country, to which they will be answerable for the same. So warning them, we're coming after you. And here back to Stephen Holbrook. He said the governor's threats failed to deter North Carolinians. So all this gun control threat, all this threat of violence, at some point they're basically saying we're leaving it to heaven and our rifles. At some point, we're not going to go along with this. We may have been quietly bending our knee to some degree and then quietly resisting and maybe loudly, but at this point, no more. This was the line in the sand. The governor's threats failed to deter the North Carolinians, considering their individual right to have weapons for defense as a starting point. So we understand that so much of the war for independence really was founded on this individual right, this natural right, the first law of nature, the right of self-preservation, which, of course, we can deduce the right of self-defense from, as Samuel Adams pointed out. They then asserted their right to associate in militia companies independent of the government. From the latter, they went on and claimed a right to use those arms against despotic government. A typical committee of safety resolution of the time referred to, quote, the painful necessity of having recourse to arms for the preservation of those rights and liberties which the principles of our Constitution and the laws of God, nature, and nations have made it our duty to defend. So it is a duty to defend the limits of power that have been given to government. That's Stephen Holbrook. Again, that'll be linked to in the show notes. Now, basically, by January of 1776, General Clinton, who was up in New England, he decided to sail down to the Carolinas with about, I think it was like 1,500 troops. He's like, let's go see what we can get done down there. His goal was to meet up in North Carolina with troops that were coming from Europe, led by Cornwallis. So on January 3rd, this is from Wikipedia, which is good basic history on this particular episode. Not always, but on January 3rd, 1776, Josiah Martin learned that an expedition of more than 2,000 troops, I think that number is incorrect. Maybe I have it wrong. I don't know. 2,000 or under, maybe 1,500, whatever. A bunch of troops under the command of General Henry Clinton was planned for the southern colonies and that their arrival was expected mid-February. So he sent word to recruiters. He got permission to recruit some Scots and some militia and some loyalists, and they wanted to fight and put down this resistance. He sent word to the recruiters that he expected them to deliver recruits to the coast by February. Mind you, the resistance at that point in North Carolina was merely just forming militia companies. They were not shooting anybody. So this isn't the British fighting in self-defense. They're just saying you're not allowed to do this. They could have just let it go, but they didn't. He dispatched Alexander McLean to Cross Creek, which is present-day Fayetteville, to coordinate activities in that area. So they were trying to meet up, do all this stuff. Cornwallis ends up getting delayed. Clinton then decides to reroute, and then we end up with something known as the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge on February 27th, 1776, known by Mike Meharry puts it, to many historians as the Lexington and Concord of the South. This is the shot heard around the world, at least in North Carolina, very important for Southern history. Patriot troops commanded by Colonel Richard Caswell defeated a force of British Highlanders and Loyalist troops. The Patriot force killed or wounded about 70 British troops and captured 850 soldiers, along with a large number of rifles and money. And so 4 weeks later, of course, we've been told by the government, by Martin and others, you can't actually have these committees. You can't have meetings. You can't have these assemblies to make any decisions for people of this province. You can't elect people as representatives of this. You're not allowed. But even after this happened, even after there's been a battle, a full-scale battle, it was a small one, but it was a full-scale battle, the North Carolina 4th Provincial Congress decided to meet. And Robert Howe, very important in this, as we'll get to in a moment as well, he remarked on the first day of the assembly, independence seems to be the word. I know of not one dissenting voice. And even though there were threats from Martin and others, that didn't actually deter them whatsoever. And days later, In April of 1776, they passed the Halifax Resolve. This was the first official action by one of the colonies in full, supporting declaring independence. They actually recommended, or they told their members in the Continental Congress, their delegates, that they were authorized, they were allowed to vote in favor of anyone. If someone else made a motion for independence, they were finally authorized to vote in favor. This was the first time this had happened. The Halifax Resolves also were the first example of a colony-wide assembly admitting that reconciliation with the British was no longer an option. A very important date is April 12th, 1776. I covered that in more detail in an episode. First for independence, the Halifax Resolves of 1776, which will be linked to in the show notes. And because of this, we get this Fourth Provisional Congress meeting. We have the Battle at Morris Creek Bridge. We have the Halifax Resolves. This led to General Henry Clinton's proclamation of May 5th, 1776. Yesterday in history, I guess, if you're watching today or listening today. And here's how he put it. Whereas these Clintons, always bad, man. Whereas a most unprovoked and wicked rebellion hath for some time past prevailed, and doth now exist within his Majesty's province of North Carolina, and the inhabitants forgetting their allegiance to their sovereign and denying the authority of the laws and statutes of the realm, have in a succession of crimes proceeded to the total subversion of all legal authority, usurping the powers of government and erecting a tyranny in the hands of congresses and committees of various denominations. That bears repeating. Basically, just organizing, having assemblies, and being armed. This is all illegal. It's got to stop. And if you fight back, it's even worse. We're going to shut you down with superior force. We are on our way. And this is the threat constantly. He said, I have it in command to proceed forthwith against all such men or bodies of men in arms, and against all such congresses and committees thus unlawfully established, as against open enemies of the state. So that was May 5th, 1776. But Clinton, as Mike Meharry points out, offered a way towards reconciliation, I guess if we can call it that. He said he's hereby offering in His Majesty's name free pardon to all such as shall lay down their arms and submit to the laws. Submitting to the laws means submitting to the power of Parliament in all cases whatsoever. We know that these types of offers kept coming. And in December of 1776, Thomas Paine actually addressed this in the American Crisis. We know the great phrase, the famous phrase, these are the times that try men's souls. We've all heard this. But a little bit further down in that first paragraph, he's basically saying, like, no matter what they offer, as long as they claim power over us in all cases whatsoever, we have to fight on. There is no reconciliation possible as long as they claim unlimited power. And Meharry points out that this wasn't even blanket amnesty. Clinton specifically excluded two prominent North Carolinians from pardon. The first person was Cornelius Harnett. And Mike writes that during the Stamp Act crisis, Harnett joined the Sons of Liberty. He went on to serve in the Wilmington Committee of Safety as a delegate to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th North Carolina Provincial Congresses, and as the president of the 5th Congress, which met in December of 1776, despite all these orders to not meet. This essentially made him the first chief executive of North Carolina's revolutionary extra-legal government. In essence, he was the first head dude as Cornelius Harnett. So he was so dangerous that they said, anyone who lays down their arms and just bends the knee, they can be free, but you got to give up your buddy Cornelius. He's bad. You also got to give up this other guy, Robert Howe, who served as a colonel in the 2nd North Carolina Regiment and later as a brigadier general in the Continental Army and commander of the Army's Southern Department. Very important guy. He was also a member of the North Carolina Provincial Congress. He earned the ire of British officials, Mike writes, as part of a colonial force that defeated the British in the Battle of Great Bridge in Virginia in December of 1775. Now this whole give up your guns, bend the knee, do what we tell you, but give up a couple of your leaders. This is pretty much what got Thomas Gage. And we shouldn't be surprised that Gage and Clinton were basically taking the same approach. They came from the same school of thought. Use violence and power, and everyone has to be subservient to what we tell them. Thomas Gage did basically the same thing to the people of Boston in 1775 following the battles of Lexington and Concord. There, he declared the state of Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion, or the colony of Massachusetts, and he offered a general amnesty to everyone who gave up their arms, who vowed total obedience to whatever law they passed, except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock. So we have Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Harnett, and Howe basically being accepted. No matter what you do, these people are so bad, they are being put to death. I covered that in another episode, No Deal for Gun Control, just last year. That'll be linked to in the show notes. But wait, there is more. Clinton says this: hereby offering in His Majesty's name free pardon to all such as shall lay down their arms and submit to the laws, excepting only from the benefit of such pardon Cornelius Harnett and Robert Howes, he says. And I do hereby require that the Provincial Congress and all committees of safety and other unlawful associations be dissolved. So in other words, stop doing what you're doing. Just do what I tell you. Give up your guns, give up your friends, and I'll give you peace. But Meharry points out that, like their brothers in arms in Boston, the Patriots of North Carolina said no deal. They ignored his demands. The 4th Provincial Congress continued to meet. The 5th Provincial Congress defied Clinton and convened in December. The committees of safety continued to operate. And as a fitting close to the saga, it was Harnett who read the Declaration of Independence publicly for the first time in North Carolina on August 1st, 1776. I think we've got a lot of interesting lessons for today, some maybe inspiration for a little bit more backbone, maybe not always sticking our neck out, but we have to have a different mentality of how we treat things that are being done to us, to our neighbors, to our friends, to our families, to our enemies even, because an attack on one's liberty is an attack on all of us. And if you want to help us reach and teach more people with this essential foundational history, we work hard every single day to get this information out to more and more people. Nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have 5-year lifetime annual options. So any consideration you can give to joining us, I'd be very grateful for you thinking about that. Maybe joining us today over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. You can also help us spread the word by leaving comments, reviews on Apple Podcasts, any other podcast platform. Smashing the like button, subscribing, getting notifications, all that stuff will help trigger algorithms and tell them to show us to more people. I really appreciate all your support. I know I'm running really long as I normally do today, but I want to say a quick hello and thank you to everyone again for being here. There's Gypsy and Render and Sarah B over on Rumble. There's Dennis and a few others, Juggalass, Citizen Debs, Haji, He Ent, and others. Over on YouTube and a few other platforms. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you had an awesome weekend and hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.